Showed up to my in-laws' anniversary party with a check for $3,000, a homemade cake, and a broken wrist in a cast. I left 20 minutes later with the check still in my purse and the full understanding that my name on their mortgage was the only thing standing between them and a phone call to a real estate attorney. This is where the story actually starts. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how it ends. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from today? The cast went from my palm to just below my elbow, wrapped in a pale blue fiberglass shell I had picked out because my daughter said it was the prettiest kind of broken. She was 6. She found silver linings in everything. I had been trying to learn that from her. I had fractured my wrist 3 weeks earlier, not doing anything dramatic, just stepping off a curb in the rain while carrying 4 bags of groceries I had picked up for my mother-in-law because she had mentioned, casually, the way she mentioned everything she wanted done, that she didn't feel like going out. I stepped wrong. I went down hard on the asphalt. A stranger helped me up and drove me to urgent care while my husband, who I had texted immediately, didn't respond for 2 hours because he was at his brother's apartment watching a game. The groceries were fine, for what it's worth. I made sure to protect the eggs on the way down. My mother-in-law sent a flower emoji when I told her about the fracture. 1 flower emoji. My husband said she felt terrible about it. I told him that was interesting because she hadn't called. But I was used to that by then. I had been used to it for 6 years. My husband's family had a way of existing that I can only describe as frictionless. For them, my father-in-law was a retired engineer who still talked about his career in the present tense, as though he had simply taken a very long weekend. My mother-in-law had the kind of effortless social charm that works beautifully at parties and evaporates completely when someone actually needs something. And then there was my brother-in-law, Colton, who was 34 years old, had never held a job for longer than 8 months, and was somehow perpetually in a situation that required everyone around him to quietly absorb the consequences. My husband Garrett was the oldest. He was also, I had come to understand, the designated responsible one, the role assigned not because he had volunteered for it, but because no one else would take it. He was good at his job. He managed a regional distribution center, worked long hours, and genuinely believed that family obligation was a form of love. I'd admired that about him once. The mortgage was my idea, originally. That sounds insane now, but at the time it made sense in the way that a lot of things made sense when I was 28 and newly married and still believed that generosity was always returned in kind. My in-laws had lost their previous home in a short sale, a story that was always told in passive voice, as things happened to them rather than choices they made, and they needed someone with a solid credit score to co-sign on a new place. Their own scores were underwater. Mine was 791. I worked in healthcare administration. I had been careful with money since I was 19 because I had to be. I knew what a good credit score cost in discipline and time. But Garrett asked, and I loved him, and so I signed. That was 4 years ago. We paid 60% of the mortgage every month because their combined Social Security didn't come close to covering it. I had set up an automatic transfer. I had never missed a payment. My in-laws had never once said thank you in a way that acknowledged the actual weight of what we were doing. The anniversary party was their 35th. Garrett had wanted to do something nice, and I had agreed because that's what I did. I baked the cake myself, lemon with elderflower frosting because my mother-in-law had mentioned once that she loved it, and I had written it down in my phone like the detail mattered. I wrote a lot of things down like that. It was a habit I had developed to compensate for the fact that no one in his family seemed to write down anything about me. I dressed carefully. Not because I wanted to impress them, but because I was bringing my daughter and I wanted her to feel like the occasion was special. She wore a yellow dress. I wore a navy wrap dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion. My cast was clean and pale blue and unavoidable. I had written "Property of Mom" on it in Sharpie because my daughter had asked me to. The party was at the house with my name in the loan documents. My mother-in-law had decorated it beautifully. I'll give her that. Peonies everywhere, white tablecloths, a little sign that said 35 years in gold foil script. She had a talent for surfaces. I walked in carrying the cake in my good hand, my daughter holding the other, and immediately understood that something was wrong from the way the room reconfigured itself around my entrance. My mother-in-law was standing near the kitchen doorway talking to a woman I had never seen before. She was maybe 30, with the kind of effortless style that comes from either money or very good taste, and she was laughing at something Colton had said. Colton was standing too close to her, his hand on the small wall beside her head, doing the thing he always did where he performed charm like a man auditioning for a role. "You made it," my mother-in-law said when she saw me. "Not you're here or I'm so glad. Just you made it, like my arrival was a logistical surprise." Of course. I held up the cake. "Lemon elderflower, you mentioned it last Easter." She glanced at the cake the way people glance at something they don't intend to eat. "Oh, how sweet!" She turned back to the woman. "Lee, this is Garrett's wife, and her little one. What a yellow dress." "Lee." I filed that away. My daughter immediately went to find her grandfather, which she loved to do because he let her push the buttons on the TV remote. I found Garrett near the drink table and kissed him on the cheek and asked, quietly, who Lee was. He got a look on his face that I have learned to translate over 6 years of marriage. It was the look that meant there was something he had decided to tell me later, and later had arrived before he was ready. "Colton's been seeing her," he said. "A few months. Mom wanted to introduce her to everyone." "Okay," I said. "That's fine. When did I become Garrett's wife in my own mother-in-law's house?" He opened his mouth and closed it and handed me a glass of sparkling water, which I thought was actually a pretty fair summary of our last 2 years. The dinner table was set for 12. I found my name card, my actual name, which I appreciated even if it was just cardstock, and settled my daughter beside me, helped her with her napkin, and reached across to pour her a small glass of juice. I noticed it before I processed it. The way you notice something is wrong with a photograph before you can identify what's been changed. My daughter's booster seat, the one I had brought from home and given to my mother-in-law's housekeeper when we arrived, was not at our seats. It was at the other end of the table. Lee was sitting in the chair beside it. The booster seat pulled close to her like she'd been placed there intentionally, beside Colton, as though she were already part of the family in a way that had been arranged without me being consulted. My daughter couldn't reach the table without the booster seat. She was 6. She was wearing a yellow dress, and she had been looking forward to this dinner since Tuesday when I told her about it, and she had asked if there would be the fancy sparkling water. I looked at my mother-in-law. She was busy talking to someone at the far end of the table and didn't look up. I looked at Garrett. He was pouring wine. I stood up. I walked down the length of the table to where the booster seat was. "Excuse me," I said to Lee, keeping my voice even and pleasant because she had nothing to do with this. "I need to move this. My daughter can't reach the table without it." Lee started to move immediately, already reaching for the booster seat. She was not the problem. I want to be clear about that. But my mother-in-law looked up then, and she said the words with the same light tone she used for everything, the tone that was designed to make you feel like your reaction was the issue and not the thing being said. "Oh, I just thought it made more sense to put Lee next to Colton. She's new to the family, we want her to feel welcome. You don't mind, do you? You're practically furniture here." The table went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something lands wrong and everyone decides in real time whether to acknowledge it. Practically furniture. She had meant it as a compliment. I know that in whatever version of the sentence was assembled in her head. Practically furniture meant practically family, meant you're so comfortable here, you don't need special treatment. I know that because I had been translating her language for 6 years, finding the best possible version of what she meant, extending every benefit of every doubt. But my wrist was in a cast from running her errand. My name was on her mortgage. My credit score had co-signed her ability to host this dinner in this house with these peonies on these white tablecloths, and she had moved my 6-year-old daughter's seat so her son's girlfriend of a few months could feel welcome. I picked up the booster seat with my good hand. I walked back to our end of the table and installed it. My daughter climbed up without complaint, completely unaware of anything. And then I sat down, and for the first 20 minutes of that dinner, I was quiet. Not sulking quiet, thinking quiet. My mother-in-law laughed at the end of the table. She asked Lee questions with genuine warmth and interest. Questions about her job, her family, where she'd grown up. The kind of questions I had never once been asked in 6 years of being at this table. I had provided my own context over time, in pieces, volunteering information nobody asked for because the silence was so consistent I had started to assume I was doing it wrong. My father-in-law told a story about the early years of the marriage that I had heard 4 times. Colton laughed at all the right moments. Garrett watched me watch the table. "You okay?" he said quietly. "I'm thinking," I said. "About what?" I looked at him. I had loved him for 8 years. I still loved him. But love and clarity are not mutually exclusive, and I was experiencing a significant amount of both. "About the mortgage," I said. He put his fork down. "I want to be precise about what happened next, because it matters that this was not impulsive. I am not an impulsive person. I am a healthcare administrator. My job is to make careful decisions about complicated systems while people are waiting on the answer. I had been making careful decisions about my in-laws' complicated financial situation for 4 years, and I'd made all of them with consideration and care. What happened next was also considered and careful. It just looked different on the outside. I reached into my purse. I took out my phone. I opened the property management app for the house, the one that handled payments, maintenance requests, and lease modifications. The house was technically a financed property, not a rental, but the management company handled the administrative relationship with the bank, and my access to the account was as the primary borrower. The renewal of the secondary loan agreement, the one that allowed my mother-in-law and father-in-law to remain the occupying residents at the favorable rate tied to my credit, was due for reconfirmation in 6 days. I had been planning to reconfirm it, the way I confirmed everything, quietly and without acknowledgement. I looked at the option on my screen that said Initiate Borrower Modification Review. Clicking it would flag the loan for a standard review process and pause the auto-renewal. It wouldn't evict anyone immediately. It would start a process that would eventually require either my continued co-borrower status or a refinancing under my in-laws' names alone, which, given their credit scores, was not a realistic option. I looked down the table at my mother-in-law, who was laughing, who was asking Lee what her favorite restaurants were, who had put my daughter's booster seat at the wrong end of the table and called me furniture in my own home. The home with my name on it. I clicked the button. I put my phone back in my purse. I cut my daughter's chicken into pieces because she had asked me twice and I had been distracted, and I kissed the top of her head and told her she looked beautiful in yellow. "I know," she said very seriously, and I laughed. A real laugh, the first one since we'd arrived. We left after dessert. My daughter had 2 pieces of cake, which I counted as a win. Garrett was quiet in the car. He had seen me on my phone during dinner. He knew me well enough to know that I didn't scroll during family events, and he knew what app I had been in because he'd seen the icon. "What did you do?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I initiated a borrower modification review on the secondary agreement," I said. "It's not irreversible yet, but it pauses the auto-renewal." He was quiet for a long time. "My parents can't refinance on their own," he said. "I know. That's essentially their housing." "I know." "Okay," he said slowly. "I know you're upset about the booster seat thing. I know what she said was." "Garrett," I said, "this isn't about the booster seat." He glanced at me. "This is about 4 years of your mother treating me like a service provider she tolerates. This is about my wrist." I held up the cast. "This is about the automatic transfer that comes out of my account on the 1st of every month and has never once been acknowledged. This is about your daughter's seat being moved for a woman your mother has known for 90 days, and your mother calling me furniture, and the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot stop thinking about, is that she said it like it was a compliment." He didn't say anything. "I'm not doing this to punish them," I said. "I'm doing this because I'm not furniture, and I need there to be a consequence attached to acting like I am." We drove the rest of the way home in silence that wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 people sitting with something true. My phone started ringing at 7:45 the next morning. I was getting my daughter ready for school, braiding her hair at the kitchen table, and the screen lit up with my mother-in-law's name. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. then my father-in-law, then Colton, who had never once called me in 6 years for any reason other than to ask if Garrett was available. I dropped my daughter at school. I went to work. I got through 3 hours of insurance reconciliation and a department meeting before I checked my voicemails. My mother-in-law's voice was tightly controlled in the first message, more clipped in the second. The third one, left at 9:16 in the morning, was not controlled at all. "I don't know what you think you're proving," she said, "but this is our home. We live here. Your little... whatever you did, the bank sent us a letter, and I need you to fix it today. Today, Vivienne. I mean it. Call me back." Vivienne. She used my name when she was angry with me and only then, which had always told me something. I went to lunch. I sat in my car in the parking garage and I called her back. "I'm not going to reverse it today," I said when she answered on the first ring. "Excuse me?" "The modification review. I'm not reversing it today. There's a 21-day review window. Nothing happens immediately." "That is our home," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. It was the first time I had ever heard her voice crack. "We have nowhere to go. Your father-in-law is 68 years old. You're talking about putting us on the street." "I'm talking about a review process," I said. "No one is on the street. But I do think we need to have a conversation about the arrangement we've been in for the last 4 years, because from where I'm sitting, it has not been a mutual one." "Mutual?" she repeated. "You're a family." "Yes," I said. "I am, and I was reminded last night that I'm practically furniture, so I think you can understand why I'd like to revisit what that means." She was quiet. "I want to meet," she said finally, "all of us this weekend." "That works," I said. "I'll be there Saturday morning. And for what it's worth, I'm bringing Garrett's daughter. She'll need her booster seat at the table." I hung up. Saturday came with overcast skies and the particular stillness that settles in before something breaks. Garrett and I drove separately, not as a statement, just because he had to stop for his father's prescription at the pharmacy and I needed to be there first. I needed to walk in on my own terms. My in-laws were in the living room when I arrived. My mother-in-law was on the sofa and I could see that she had been crying earlier in the week. Not that morning, but recently, in the past few days. My father-in-law looked smaller than I remembered, the way people look smaller when they've had a shock. Colton was not there. I noted that. "Where's Colton?" I asked. "He's not part of this," my mother-in-law said. "He lives here rent-free," I said. "He's part of this." She looked at my father-in-law. My father-in-law looked at the floor. "He'll be here at 10, my father-in-law said quietly. I nodded. I sat down in the armchair across from them, and I didn't wait for Garrett because I had something I needed to say before the dynamics of the room shifted. "I want you to know that I don't want to take your home," I said. "That's not what this is. I have no interest in doing that to you, and I don't think it would be right. What I want is for both of you to understand, clearly, what has been happening for 4 years, because I think you've been operating as though this arrangement is invisible, as though the money appears on its own, as though I'm infrastructure." My mother-in-law opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," I said. "I have never once been asked how I feel about this. I have never been thanked in a way that matched the weight of what we've contributed. I've been called furniture in my own home, and a house that exists in its current form because of my credit score, and when I tried to figure out if that bothered me, I realized I already knew the answer. It's bothered me for years. I just kept adjusting." My father-in-law looked at me steadily. He was a quiet man. I had always thought quietness was neutrality, but I was reconsidering that. "You're right," he said. My mother-in-law turned her head toward him as if he had said something in a foreign language. "She's right, Helene," he said. And there it was, the name. He used it so rarely that hearing it had the weight of an announcement. We don't say thank you. We don't ask. We take it the same way we breathe, like it's just there, like it'll always be there. He looked at me. That's not right. The room was quiet enough that I could hear my daughter through the window in the backyard talking to herself the way she did when she was making up stories. Garrett came in at 9:50, stood in the doorway, and read the room correctly enough to sit down without saying anything. Colton arrived at 10, and I could see from the way he walked in that he had been briefed, and that being briefed had produced defensiveness rather than contrition. He sat in the chair by the bookshelf and said immediately, "I feel like I'm being blamed for something I wasn't even part of." "You're not being blamed," I said. "But you live here and you should understand what the arrangement is and what it costs." "I pay my share," he said. I looked at my mother-in-law because we both knew that wasn't true. "Colton," my father-in-law said. Colton looked at his hands. "We talked for 2 hours. Not the kind of talking that resolves everything. That's not real, and I had learned to be skeptical of conversations that tied up too neatly. But we talked honestly, which was rarer and worth more. My mother-in-law said things that were hard for her to say. I believe she meant them, or at least the part of her that had the capacity for genuine feeling meant them, which is not the same as the habit of her being changed, but it was something to work with. She apologized for what she'd said about the furniture. She used the word apologize, which she had never done with me in 6 years, and I watched the effort it took her and I didn't minimize it. My father-in-law said he wanted to contribute more, practically, to the mortgage. That he had some savings he'd been holding back from guilt rather than necessity, a habit from the years when there had been nothing. He looked at Colton when he said it. Colton looked at the bookshelf. I told them I would reverse the modification review, not because the conversation had fixed everything, but because I believed it had started something, and because I was not trying to burn the house down, I was trying to stop being invisible in it. What I did not reverse, and what I told them clearly I would not reverse, was the expectation, the one I was setting, out loud, for the first time, that from now on, this arrangement would be spoken about, that contributions would be acknowledged, that my daughter would always have a seat at this table, that I was not infrastructure, I was a person, I was their family, and the two things were not mutually exclusive, but they were also not the same thing. Garrett held my hand on the drive home. My daughter fell asleep in her booster seat before we hit the highway, her mouth a little open, the yellow dress wrinkled now from a full day of being 6. "Thank you," he said after a while. "For what?" "For not blowing it up," he said, "and for not pretending it was fine." "Both things were options," I agreed. He squeezed my hand. "Things didn't transform overnight. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise because that's not how people work, or how families work, or how families work, or how any of this works. My mother-in-law still sometimes defaults to the breezy gloss she puts on everything, the tone that makes weight feel weightless. My father-in-law started sending his portion of the mortgage to our account directly without being asked, which was small and concrete and meant more to me than any amount of words. Colton got a job in January, actually kept it. 3 months and counting. I wrote it down in my phone. The cast came off 7 weeks after the party. My daughter was devastated about the blue, which I thought was a very reasonable response. We bought her a pale blue bicycle instead, and she decided that was an acceptable trade. I went back to that dinner table at Thanksgiving. My mother-in-law had set the table herself, and when I sat down, there was a small card at my place. Not a name card. Just a piece of paper she'd folded in half. Inside, in her handwriting, it said, "We saved you a seat. We're glad you're here." It wasn't everything, but it was the first thing that had ever been just for me at that table, and I kept it. I still have it in the drawer of my nightstand, under a few other things, where I can find it if I need to remember that people can shift, slowly, and that sometimes naming the invisible is the first step toward making it matter. The wrist healed clean, the credit score is intact, and I am not furniture. I never was. The note my mother-in-law left at my place setting at Thanksgiving is still in my nightstand drawer. I don't look at it often. But I know it's there, and knowing it's there matters more than I expected. I've been thinking about what actually happened in that sequence of events. The dinner, the phone screen, the 21-day review window, the Saturday morning conversation, and what I keep coming back to is that none of it was about revenge. That's the part people get wrong when they hear a story like this. They think the phone was a weapon. It wasn't. It was the first honest thing I had done in 4 years of a relationship where I had been quietly pretending that being taken for granted was the same as being loved. What I did required me to understand something clearly before I could act on it. I had to be honest with myself about the reality of the arrangement, what it actually cost, what it was actually worth, and what it meant that the cost had never once been acknowledged. That kind of clarity doesn't come from anger. Anger is too loud. Clarity comes from sitting in a dark car in a parking garage at lunchtime and asking yourself without flinching, what is actually true here? That took something I had been building for years without knowing it, a willingness to see the situation as it was rather than as I needed it to be. And then it took something else. It took knowing that the right move was not the satisfying move, and doing it anyway. I didn't pull the modification review to blow up their lives. I pulled it to create a pause, a moment where something invisible became visible and couldn't be undone. That required a kind of discipline I don't think I'd fully had before. The satisfying move would have been walking out of that dinner and never going back. The right move was harder, slower, and required me to sit across from people who had hurt me and stay present enough to hear them try. That's not weakness. That's the harder thing by a significant margin. What my father-in-law did, that quiet, unrehearsed "she's right," that also required something. It required a man who had spent 30 years choosing the easier path to choose differently, once, in a room full of people, with his wife watching. I don't know what it cost him. I suspect it cost him more than it looked like from the outside. I respect it because I know how much it takes to tell the truth when you've been comfortable with the alternative for a very long time. My daughter will grow up watching how this plays out. She'll watch me navigate relationships where the giving and receiving aren't always equal. She'll watch me hold a line without holding a grudge. She'll watch her grandfather pay back a debt in $200 installments with the same steadiness he used to pay for his prescription every month. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's what doing the right thing actually looks like when you're not performing it for anyone. I'm not furniture. I never was. But I also wasn't blameless. I had kept myself invisible for 4 years by accepting less than I was worth and calling it generosity. The moment I stopped adjusting and started being honest, the whole room had to reckon with something real. That's the thing about naming what's been invisible. You can't unname it, and sometimes that's exactly enough.